In the 4th century BC, the Samnites, an ancient Italic people who lived in the southern central region of Italy known as Samnium, became involved in a series of wars with the Roman Republic. As the title of today's episode indicates, this conflict was known as the Samnite Wars, those that would be threefold and would span from the years 343 BC all the way to 290 BC. The Samnites, an Oscan-speaking people, Oscan being an extinct Indo-European language that was commonly used in southern Italy and considered a sister language to Latin, were thought to have derived from the earlier Italic people of the Sabines, and would come to form a confederation of 4 hill tribes from the Herpini, Cordini, Caraceni, and Pentri. This confederation of tribes were, funnily enough, allies with Rome, and had actually taken part in the Roman conflict against the Gauls in the year 354 BC. But despite the alliance held between the Roman Republic and the Samnites, it seems the two sides were destined to come to blows, for the Samnite Confederation would prove to be just as ambitious as Rome in their own efforts of expansion. Whilst the Samnites did not tread on the toes of their Roman allies by expanding into Roman-controlled territories, they did conduct a less noteworthy attack on a smaller tribe, known as the Sidicini, who were situated on the southwestern border of the Samnite region. The Sidicini were in dire need of assistance from the attack, and so they turned to their southern neighbours in the region of Campania, and requested aid from the Campanian city-state of Capua. Heeding the call, Capua provided their assistance in the form of an army, but to their shock, the Samnites were able to crush their forces when they arrived at Sidicini territory. Seeing the Campanian army as incentive, the Samnites then advanced into Campania, defeated them on their own turf, and then besieged the city. Campania, which had only sought to aid the Sidicini, now had its city-state of Capua infested by the vicious Samnite warriors. Having bitten off more than they could chew, Campania found itself doing what many Italic regions did when they were under raid. They sent envoys to Rome to beg for help. But as mentioned, this presented a bit of a dilemma for the Romans, because the Samnites were still their allies, and had been for the better part of a decade. Yet to see them expand into the region of Campania was even more so concerning for them, especially considering the coastal plains of Campania consisted of fertile land that the Romans didn't quite want the Samnites to get their hands on. It is believed that upon hearing the request from Campania, the Senate was moved, but despite their fears over the advancement of the Samnites, they honoured their alliance with them and refused to attack. Campanian ambassadors were eager to change the mind of the Senate, however, and proposed prospective deals to Rome, including total alliances and airtight treaties, some of which promised to use the region's wealth in aiding Rome with its eternal battle against its sworn enemy, the infamous Volsci tribe. Furthermore, they also stipulated, and perhaps planted a seed in the heads of the senators, that if Rome was to sit back and allow the Samnites to invade Campania, then Campania would be forced to lend what was left of its strength to the Samnites, and that once the Samnites had that, they would probably come for Rome next, but in even greater force. The promise of the fertile lands of Campania also made it hard for the senators to simply shut down the offers being made, but eventually, the Romans ultimately refused the proposal and chose to honour the original agreement between themselves and the Samnite people. Well, that is until the Campanian embassy, instead of returning to face their fate against the Samnites, surrendered all of its people, including the city of Capua and the power it held, into the hands of Rome. This dramatic gesture filled the Senate with a profound sense of compassion for the unfortunate people, and with Campania now suddenly under its realm of control, Roman honour dictated that it would need to be protected. So Rome sought to establish peaceful negotiations with the Samnite people on the account that they were still allies, and requested that in the spirit of their alliance, they should walk away from Campania and never return in a hostile capacity to the now Roman-controlled territory. These envoys were thought to have delivered this message in a Samnite National Assembly, so that there could be no dispute or misinterpretation of the conditions. But the Samnites rejected the Roman request and told the envoys quite clearly that they intended to wage war against Capua and would not hold back, likely on the account that when they had initiated their siege on the city, it was not under Roman control. Furthermore, it was probably argued that Campania had attacked them first, and that the Samnites felt like they had a right at retribution. When news of the Samnites' defiance reached Rome, Rome did what they did best. They prepared for war. It's up for debate whether this war was adopted by Rome in an effort to take the fertile lands of Campania for itself, or if this was an effort to stamp out the Samnites before they could get their hands on it first. If the Samnites were to absorb Campania, they would prove to be a difficult adversary to overcome, particularly if they were left at Campania to prosper and grow. Therefore, it may have been in Rome's best interests, at least in the long term, to remove the Samnites before they became too formidable. Additionally, some might say that Rome committed to war against the Samnites because of its newfound appreciation for Campania and its sudden responsibility in defending it as a Roman territory. But some historians reserve the idea that Rome always acted in self-defense, or at least they try to justify their battles as self-defense so as to portray themselves less as the aggressors and more as the virtuous defenders. Ancient Roman contemporaries, none the least being Livy, are often criticised for their possible distortion or suppression of potential facts, in favour of making Rome look like the good guys. In this, Rome was thought to only commit to just wars, or carefully considered conflicts that made them look like they were responding out of self-defense. The same can be said here in the conflict with the Samnites, where the Senate might have argued that they were warring with the hill tribes to protect Capua, for it could not protect itself. Here, Rome would present itself as a noble and righteous army that fought to defend the honour and the people that it neighboured, and not because they would benefit greatly in the long run from the acquisition of the land and the annihilation of another daunting set of tribes. By manoeuvring themselves in this fashion, or by often provoking other states into attacking first, Rome could maintain a facade of a guiltless and principled army that only invaded others so as to ensure its own safety from future attacks. By doing this, they were also able to boost the morale of their soldiers and civilians, and create a consensus that they were doing the right thing, as well as maintaining the good graces in international public opinion. It was not uncommon in the later years of the Roman Republic, when records were more ample, for the Senate to manipulate diplomatic circumstances to make it seem like Rome was acting in self-defense, when in actuality, they were just furthering Roman expansion. Of course, this would have been Livy's attempt to yet again portray Rome as heroes, and that their involvement in the conflict would then be seen as a selfless act of bravery in standing up for the little guy. Such an idea of heroism, and the military efforts used to demonstrate said heroism, would have been a highly attractive trait back then, one that could earn a man noteworthy praise from the patrician aristocracy. Honour and glory were two elements of Roman society that were held in high regard, so it would make sense why Livy wanted to showcase Rome in that light. It should also be noted that Rome didn't always help neighbouring cities, and that there are many recorded examples of Rome simply ignoring such appeals, implying that the Senate probably picked and chose which conflicts to get involved in based on what they could get out of it. In Campania's case, as mentioned, it would have likely been to obtain the fertile land, and to prevent the Samnites from acquiring it for themselves, which might have been a problem for Rome later on. The war was kicked off by the two consuls of Rome at the time, and would consist of three major battles. The first consul, Marcus Valerius Corvus, went directly to Campania in what would become known as the Battle of Mount Gaurus, which is regarded as the first skirmish of the war, and the first meeting of Rome and the Samnites as enemies. Livy's account of the altercation, that which has since been scrutinized by modern historians, tells us that Marcus Valerius Corvus camped his army at Mount Gaurus, and waited there with the might of his army before committing to a full-scale attack. The Samnites meanwhile had already moved into Campania, and having set the stage for the battle to commence, were eager to have at it. Having already established themselves on the battlefield, the Samnites held the advantage, having had the time to become more acquainted with the land. But nonetheless, it did not falter the stride of Valerius's army as they stormed out of their camp and into the enemy lines. Livy described the battle as being evenly matched, and in an attempt to break apart the solid Samnite defence, Valerius ordered a cavalry charge, that which actually failed, and resulted in the Romans falling back. It's unknown what kind of mental state the Romans might have been in after seeing the cavalry warded off, but it can be guessed that it invoked some desperation on Valerius's part, who took it upon himself to lead an infantry assault upon the Samnite defence. But yet again, even this was beaten back, and despite receiving some devastating losses, the Samnites did not yield. It is unknown for sure how long the Battle of Mount Gaurus lasted, but Livy states that it had taken a whole day, and that by the last hours of daylight, the Romans were no closer to beating the Samnites back. With this frustration building amongst the Roman ranks, they went berserk, and made one last rage-filled dash against the Samnites, that which broke apart their ranks, and sent them fleeing from Campania. The Romans were said to give chase, cutting down many of the Samnites as they trudged their way back to their hills. It is said by Livy that had it not been for the hours of darkness, none of the Samnites would have escaped this encounter. Livy then makes the bold claim that the Samnites were questioned why they had fled the Romans in their final charge, and that the Samnites had said it was the eyes of the Romans, which seemed to them to blaze, along with their furious expression and frenzied glare. The likeliness of them actually saying this, however, is up for some debate, for Livy provides no names nor context for such a statement. Livy concludes that after the Samnites had fled Campania, all of the citizens at Capua came out to congratulate the Romans on their victory. As mentioned, modern historians often dispute Livy's bold claims of this battle, believing them to be merely inventions by him with little to no actual historical substance. It is believed the role of Valerius Corvus, perhaps most notably his leading of an infantry by himself into enemy lines after the failure of the cavalry, not only sounds strategically reckless, but was probably used by Livy to promote the consul as a vestige of Roman resolution and strength. The second battle of the First Samnite War, known as the Battle of Saticula, was the confrontation that the second consul, Aulus Cornelius Cosus, would find himself in. Again, coming from Livy, we are told that Cosus was marching to Campania from Saticula, and decided to lead his army through a mountain pass that descended into a narrow valley. What he didn't know at the time, however, was that the Samnites had already come to occupy the high ground of the valley, and were waiting for Cosus and his army to descend into it. Once the Romans realised that they were walking straight into an ambush, it was too late to retreat. Livy tells us then that Publius Ducius Mus, a military tribune, spotted a hilltop in the valley that had not been secured by the Samnites, and that he was able to lead a few warriors to obtain it. Too busy tormenting Cosus and the main body of the army, the Samnites failed to realize that Decius and a handful of warriors had segued off onto their own summit. When they did notice, they became so distracted that they abandoned their assault on Cosus, and allowed the Roman army to retreat to more favourable ground. With Cosus and the main army retreating, the Samnites turned their attention to Decius, and would have cleared him off the hill had they not been concerned about the imminent nightfall and perhaps the possibility that Decius's bold move might have been a trap. With their hesitation, Decius was able to sneak around the hilltop to survey the Samnite positions. Having established a general sense of where his enemies were, Decius ordered his men to move silently through the Samnite pickets, and if they were lucky, they could sneak their way through the Samnite forces and escape undetected. This worked surprisingly well for Decius, and they were actually able to make it halfway through the Samnite terrain before they were discovered. To counter this, Livy tells us that Decius let out a mighty battle cry that sent the Samnites, some of which were sleeping, into disarray and chaos. With this disruption, the Samnites were slow to realize just what was going on, which allowed Decius's men to cut their way through their opposition. By the next morning, Decius was celebrated for his genius maneuvering through the Samnite terrain, and his ultimate diversion which ensured the safety of the consul and the rest of the army. With this, Decius and Cosus then attacked the Samnites, who were suddenly unprepared for the assault, and were scattered once more. Here their camp was taken by the Roman army, and 30,000 of them were thought to have either fled or were cut down. But yet again, modern historians have come to doubt the accuracy of Livy's account, from the unlikeliness of the Romans under Decius sneaking through the Samnite lines to the eventual slaughter that Livy recounts reached 30,000 lives in total, a number thought to be grossly exaggerated. The ambushes of the Samnite people would continue to be something of a motif in Livy's narratives of the future Samnite wars, so it's difficult to determine which ones may or may not have happened. The heroics of Decius in particular often come under some scrutiny, with some historians pointing to similar acts of heroism that had taken place in the Punic Wars. Others dispute Decius's involvement at all, and determine Livy's account of him to be an effort by the historian to foreshadow his sacrifice in the year 340 during the Latin War. But still determined to win this war, the Samnites gathered what was left of their forces from their defeats against Marcus Valerius Corvus and Aulus Cornelius Cosus, and decided to lay siege to the eastern edge of Campania, at the city of Susula. Yet again, the following details of the battle come from Livy, who wrote that Marcus Valerius Corvus became aware of the Samnite attempt to take Susula, and immediately dropped everything to meet them there. Livy makes a point of telling us that Corvus had most of his supplies and baggage left behind in Capua, perhaps on the assumption that it would slow them down on their march to Susula. Here the Samnites made a grave error in underestimating the size and speed of Corvus's approach, and instead of preparing their defences, ended up sending the army to forage for food. It is believed that the Samnite scouts had either mistaken the size of Corvus's army or simply hadn't been able to locate it, and thus proceeded to incorrectly guess as to how many units he really had. Feeling assured by the idea that Rome was not going to march this far south with a considerable body of men, foraging for food became the priority. Naturally, Corvus recognized this folly, and swooped in to destroy an unprepared and mostly scattered Samnite army. Livy tells us that upon Corvus's arrival, he was able to take the Samnite camp with a single assault, and picked off the foragers thereafter with relative ease. But yet again, the validity of this account by Livy comes under even more scrutiny than the previous two battles, with some historians deeming the Samnite losses, those that Livy tells us rack up to the tens of thousands, to be a clear exaggeration. Yet another problem with the historicity of the First Samnite War is that the ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus doesn't mention it at all, leading some historians to believe that the war had never actually happened, and that Livy might have made the whole thing up, or at least embellished a series of battles with the Samnites into that of a war. But other modern historians argue that it does not make sense for Livy to invent an account that paints Rome as quite wishy-washy in terms of their allegiances. Notice that regardless of whatever compassion Livy wished to show in the face of Rome aiding Campania, they still turned on the Samnites, and thus showed a lack of loyalty and integrity, something that Livy would not have wished to highlight. The conclusion of the war would see both consuls, Marcus Valerius Corvus and Aulus Cornelius Cosus, rewarded for their efforts. Beyond the year 341, there did not appear to be any conflicts with neighbouring regions for the next 2 years, which saw Rome and the Samnites come to renew their treaty, with the Samnites realising their defeat and recognising Roman authority over Campania. But whilst there was no fighting taking place with neighbouring regions, there was some animosity internally with the newly acquired Campania. It would seem that the soldiers of Campania had become accustomed to a more luxurious lifestyle than the one Rome was offering, and with that, they plotted to seize several of the Campanian garrisons and establish themselves as the new rulers. But when the plot was discovered, the Campani in question started a revolt and mutinied against their new Roman overseers. To deal with this uprising, the Senate elected Marcus Valerius Corvus as dictator, who was able to convince the Campani to lay down their arms peacefully, in perhaps a most uncharacteristic resolution to such a conflict. But yet again, there are historians who believe that this event never actually took place, and that the narrative was created to provide context for various reforms that were passed in the same year. Amongst these reforms were conditions that no one person could be re-elected into the same office within less than 10 years, as well as the progressive ruling that one of the two consuls would have to be of the plebeian class. Whilst Livy's account is often disputed, it does not take away from the fact that Rome did most likely lend its strength to its neighbours, but only if there was something in it for them. Whilst this was disguised as a noble, heroic effort, it was actually a much more strategic and insidious move on behalf of the Senate, whereby they would absorb the nation in need, bolster their own ranks, and eliminate another territory, or at least pacify it, like they did here with the Samnites. Whilst this would only be the first of the Samnite wars, Rome most certainly came off in a far better position by taking the wealthy land of Campania as a most welcome prize. But let me know what you thought about today's episode on Roman history, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's video, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.